Well, hello and welcome to Nature Connects, TNC and Massachusetts webinar series that connects you with scientists, experts, influencers, and our partners from New England and around the world. Thanks for joining us today. I'm your host, Steve Kirk. I'm TNC's Coastal Program Director. We have an exciting program for you today. We'll be joined by Jordanna Barley and Boze Hancock for an update on our supporting oyster aquaculture and restoration program, where TNC works with partners to purchase oysters from farmers and plant them on restoration sites. Before their presentation, I'm going to help set the stage. Estuaries are incredibly valuable areas where fresh and salt water meet. These ecosystems are the nursery grounds for the seafood that we eat, protect us from rising seas and storms, sequester and store sizable amounts of carbon, and are the places where we live, work, and play. An element of estuaries that help them function properly are healthy populations of shellfish, like oysters. These engines of our estuaries filter water, removing excess nutrients, provide shelter and food for other species, and can stabilize the shoreline. Unfortunately, this is one of the most imperiled marine habitats on the planet, with upwards of 85% of them gone, and in our area, that number is much higher. The Nature Conservancy has invested significantly in restoring this habitat with over 250 project sites across the world. But the scale of the problem is so great that we need an all-hands approach to addressing our coastal environmental challenges. Enter the shellfish aquaculture industry. Growing shellfish is a significant driver of the blue economy, while also providing many of the same environmental services that natural oyster habitat has to offer. This concept of restorative aquaculture is a powerful one, growing food while improving the ecological condition in and around the farm. I'm thrilled to be able to provide an update on the SOAR program with my colleagues, Jordanna and Boze. So before we dive into the program, I'll share a little about our guests. Jordanna Barley is a PhD candidate and in her 5th and final year as an organismic and evolutionary biology program at UMass Amherst. She's studying how global change is affecting marine ecosystems and how changes to organisms' physiology can alter where they can live. Jordanna worked with the Massachusetts chapter and the Global Aquaculture team on the Supporting Oyster Aquaculture and Restoration project, which she'll be presenting about today. She was funded in part by an NSF program and was working with me and the whole team for over 6 months. Boze is the senior marine restoration scientist for TNC's Global Oceans team. Boze comes from a fishery research background in Western Australia, but has spent the last 20 years based in the US, developing marine habitat restoration around the US, as well as in China, Hong Kong, Australia, New Zealand, and Europe. He provides technical support for partners and numerous projects throughout TNC's global portfolio. He collaborates to provide science support for marine habitat restoration, particularly through quantifying the benefits these habitats provide, and works with the United Nations Decade on Ecological Restoration and international organizations to help align the work on a global scale. We are incredibly fortunate to have Boze leading the restoration side of the SOAR program, as well as an active advisor to our work here in Massachusetts. As you think of questions for Jordanna and Boze, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Thanks so much for joining us today. So Jordanna, take it away.
All right, thanks so much for the introduction, Steve. All right. I should see my screen now, so if somebody could let me know if you don't, then I will fix that. All right. I'm very excited to be talking to you today about the SOAR program and what I've been doing with TNC for the past 6 months or so. Like Steve said, my name is Jordanna Barley, and I have been working with TNC as an NSF intern, and I'm very excited to give my presentation today. All right, so I'm sure I don't have to remind anyone that the COVID-19 quarantine led to the closure of bars and restaurants. This, of course, led to a dramatic decrease in the demand of farmed oysters, meaning that oyster farmers were struggling to market their oysters, as most people buy farmed oysters through bars and restaurants. This, of course, increased the supply of market-ready oysters and could have led to the collapse of farmed oyster market. This, in conjunction with the lack of income, put nearly 3,000 jobs in this industry at risk. The SOAR program aimed to support more than 100 shellfish companies and 200 jobs in this industry by buying these market-ready oysters and deploying them in native shellfish reefs. This program aimed to deploy about 5 million oysters across 27 acres of shellfish reefs in 20 different restoration sites. In order to make sure that the program could be set up with relative speed, the program used already established restoration sites that were already permitted with monitoring programs to make sure that this program could be set up easily. Deployment happened over 3 stages over a 12-month period from fall 2020 to the winter of 2021. All oysters that were deployed went through a thorough check for pathogens to make sure the disease was not spread from farm to restoration site. On the East Coast, the Eastern oyster was deployed, and on the West Coast in Washington, the native Olympia oyster was deployed on the West Coast. The first phase of this program hit many of the goals for the program, as you can see from the statistics at the bottom of your screen. And this particular photo shows a crew standing at the top of about 300,000 oysters that were about to be deployed onto a restoration site because of the SOAR program. Excuse me. Okay. So as Steve mentioned, TNC has spent a lot of time and resources on oyster reef restoration. And the SOAR program does differ a little bit from traditional oyster reef restoration programs. So traditionally, oyster reef restoration is done by deploying juvenile oysters that are often called spat, that are settled onto shell and then put those shells out onto the restoration site. So this is what that looks like. You can see these little circles and dots here are juvenile oysters that are then settled onto this larger oyster shell. Those shells will either be put out onto a reef at a restoration site or put into a closed cage system. The SOAR program deployed adult market-ready oysters onto restoration sites. And this is an important distinction because there are a couple of trade-offs to both methods. Deploying juvenile oysters, it's much more cost-effective, but there's often very high mortality of the juvenile oysters in the first year of deployment once they've been put out onto the restoration reef. Also, you have to wait several years for these oysters to get to reproductive age and add to the breeding biomass of the reef. However, raising oysters to adulthood is very expensive and time-consuming, but this method should immediately increase the breeding biomass of the reef and therefore increase the settlement of juvenile oysters. So the SOAR program took advantage of the unique opportunity that the COVID-19 pandemic provided, as there were a lot of adult oysters that needed to have a home, and therefore this method could be tested. So in addition, the restoration sites for this program were what's called recruitment limited. This means that these sites were not able to initially, before the SOAR program, were not able to produce juveniles at the rate needed to sustainably keep or grow a population of oysters without any human intervention. So therefore, in addition to the goal of supporting the aquaculture industry, the SOAR program had 2 general goals for restoration. First, by putting out adult oyster, the hope was to immediately build the breeding oyster population at the restoration site, and then hopefully because of that, increase the settlement of juvenile oysters. So obviously, when trying out a new method at such a scale as this, we need to make sure that we collect data to determine if we are able to accomplish what we set out to do. So first, we want to make sure that the oysters are able to survive and reproduce in their new home. So that's going to be the bulk of the data that I'm going to be presenting to you today. Also, it's important to start collecting data at the beginning of a project like this to make sure that we have a time series as the project goes on, so that we can look at survival and recruitment from the onset of the project. And finally, it's important to assess what sites fared well and which did not with this approach to make sure that we can make decisions going forward as the project continues. So all of the restoration sites that were chosen for this project already had monitoring programs in place before the SOAR program started. So we just used those monitoring programs and adapted it to these applications. The data that I'm going to be showing you today are the survival of the oysters that were deployed, as well as the juvenile settlement data. And we're hoping to use these data to see if the SOAR program was actually able to increase the breeding population and increase reproduction and recruitment of juveniles at the sites. So we're going to start with percent survival. And we're obviously hoping to answer our first question with these data. Were the oysters able to survive in their new home? And I'm going to be showing you an average percent survival, and these data are averaged across replicate sites. All of the data I'm going to be showing you in the next couple of slides have the same structure and format. So I'm just going to orient you really quickly. On the left side, I have a map here with the states and the sites that I'm going to be showing you data for. The red dots are the sites that I'm showing you data for. And the graph on the right has site on the x-axis and oyster percent survival from 0 to 100% on the y-axis. All right. So overall, at these particular sites in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, survival is relatively high, above 50%, which is very encouraging and what we would like to see. In New York and New Jersey, we have a similar story here. Some sites are hovering around 50%, while others have survival a little higher than that. We do have one site in New Jersey, Tuckerton Reef, all the way to the far right of your screen, that did not fare so well. I believe that site had high predation from rays on the oysters, and so that site had high mortality. But again, these kinds of data are really important, as this is the first iteration of this project, going forward to know what sites did fare well and what sites did not. In Maryland, we're seeing very high survival, hovering around 75%, with very low variation at these sites. And in Washington, on the West Coast, where the native to the West Coast Olympia oyster was deployed, very high survival, almost 100% at the Barron Point site, and hovering around 75 or 80% for the Squaxin site. Overall, the oyster survival through the SOAR program was over 50% at most sites. There were a couple of exceptions, but like I said, these data are really important in figuring out the future of the SOAR project, making sure that we know what sites perform well and which ones do not. Additionally, there was some evidence to show that we were not very good at distinguishing between oysters and that were already there at the restoration site and the adult single oysters that were deployed through the SOAR program. So we're going to be making some changes to the monitoring methods going forward. Next, we're going to be looking at juvenile oyster settlement. This is generally referred to as recruitment, and I think I've said that word a couple of times already in the presentation, but that's just what that means, is the settlement of juvenile oysters. And also a reminder that all of the sites chosen for this SOAR project are all recruitment limited, meaning that they have not been able to have high enough recruitment of juvenile oysters to sustain or grow a population of oysters at that site. All right, so we're starting with New Hampshire. This graph here just has on the Y juvenile oyster count, so just the number of oysters or the number of juvenile oysters in each particular year, which is on the x-axis. This site had a dramatic decrease in juvenile oyster settlement from about 2008 to around 2014, and didn't really see much recruitment from then on. In 2020 was when the SOAR oysters were deployed, and you can see a pretty high jump in recruitment after that. Of course, right now, because of the amount of data that we have, this is just a correlation, but we are seeing a correlation between the deployment of SOAR oysters and an increase in recruitment at this site. In Massachusetts, we have a very similar story. The difference in this graph here is recruitment density by meters squared, not the number of oysters at that particular site. So the Bourne and Fairhaven sites on the left side of the graph were established in 2018 and monitored for the first time in 2019. In 2019, no recruitment was observed at either the Bourne or the Fairhaven site. And in 2020, after the SOAR oysters were deployed, we're seeing some marginal amounts of recruitment at the Bourne site and a very high amount of juvenile oysters at the Fairhaven site. At Martha's Vineyard at the far right of the graph, we don't have a time series, so we don't really know what recruitment was like before the SOAR oysters were deployed, but the very high amount of recruitment density at that site is very encouraging. In Maryland, again, we don't have a time series of recruitment for these particular sites, but just the fact that they are producing juveniles and settling in the first place is very promising. So just overall, we are seeing a correlation in increased juvenile oyster settlement with the SOAR oyster deployment. As I said before, we do need a lot more data to determine if this is because of the SOAR oyster program, but the correlation in and of itself is encouraging. Okay, so the SOAR program, like I said before, took advantage of this unique opportunity that the COVID-19 pandemic provided to try out a new method of oyster reef restoration by putting out adult oysters. Our data show that adding adult oysters could jumpstart the settlement of juvenile oysters quickly, which might be able to make a restoration reef project self-sustaining quicker. Of course, we are by no means saying that this should revolutionize or completely change how oyster reef restoration is done, but this method, using this method in conjunction with traditional oyster reef restoration, might be able to jumpstart this recruitment in recruitment limited sites and could help the reef become more established quicker and increase the ecosystem services that oysters provide. Thanks so much for listening, and I'm going to pass it off to Boze.
Well, thank you, Jory. Hopefully that has come up. So we've been hearing from Jory about one part of the SOAR program, actually, and it was looking at the kind of so what, how did we measure and what's happened from that original SOAR program. What I'd like to do is walk us through where we want to take this program and what we hope it looks like moving into the future. If I can get slides to advance. Here we go. So SOAR phase 1 is what Jory has been describing, which was really a COVID relief exercise and using the industrial might of the aquaculture industry and applying that to habitat restoration, which really does need all the help it can get, as Steve was pointing out. One of the things that I would like to point out here is that, Jory was describing for us the purchase program and the monitoring that was done from that, there was another component to the first phase of SOAR, and that was a resiliency fund. So I'll run just briefly through that because that's relevant to the next stage of SOAR as we see it moving forward. I am having difficulty advancing. Here we go. So the resiliency fund was established about a year after the actual purchase program, the aim being really twofold for the whole SOAR program was to keep the oyster growers afloat and also use their muscle and use that in the service of habitat restoration. So we got the purchase program going first and then created a resiliency grant. And the resiliency grant was really designed to, as a funding mechanism, to help the growers and the aquaculture industry develop ideas or test ideas that lay in the intersection of conservation and aquaculture. As Steve said, we see aquaculture as being of benefit. More of these filter feeding bivalves in the system is better. And if the aquaculture industry can actually help with restoration, that is an additional bonus. So that was the intention of the program. The priorities were really looking at engaging farmers in conservation, looking at efficient farming operations, new products, diversity in the industry itself in terms of both those participating and the species that are being used. So it was nearly 1.3 million was set aside for this program, 36 grants awarded, and there were some really quite innovative ideas that were tested out, which have been fantastic. And here's just a couple of examples. They kind of span the spectrum from Shell to Shore program in Georgia, which was actually recycling oyster shell from restaurants and developing a recycling program to help restoration in that state. In Florida, they were using discard and really testing how to use discard material from aquaculture to build oyster reefs. Oceans Alaska was a hatchery that was granted an award and really worked with the local tribal entities there to develop hatchery capacity in the tribe itself. And a couple of programs, actually one in Florida and one in North Carolina, were looking at using urchins as cleaning agents in oyster grow out gear. So seeding the gear with urchins, which are herbivores and eat the algae that starts to foul the gear. Some of those ideas are just kind of examples of what was being done. There were a couple of larger programs as well, one looking at setting up a mobile lab to measure denitrification rates from restored oyster reef in Massachusetts. Another interesting one. But where we would like to take phase 2 of this program is to not focus as much on COVID relief. Obviously, the COVID window is behind us at this point, but the partnerships that were developed through SOAR 1.0 really were extraordinarily beneficial, I think, to everybody. Jory's done a great job of describing some of the science and the measurements, but one of the unexpected benefits that we got from the SOAR program was the alignment of the 3 components of the industry. That's the aquaculture sector. The growers really did appreciate the help and were very enthusiastic in their support for restoration. They get the need for conservation. Obviously, the conservation community is very happy to have the support, but also the regulators that control and create the policy around the aquaculture and restoration industries were also very on side and very supportive of the entire program. And aligning those 3 groups really does make just about anything possible. So we would like to really transition the COVID relief to a restoration program at scale. And we believe this is a mechanism for doing that. And for the SOAR Second phase, we have secured 6.3 million. It really is a public-private partnership. 3 million of that federal, 3.3 private funding. And what we want to do there is leverage that aquaculture capacity for conservation in a similar way to Jory has described with the purchase program. We want to develop that public-private partnership and do the monitoring to demonstrate the effectiveness, and also secure some long-term funding, which I'll describe in a minute, and continue building the resiliency of the aquaculture industry as a beneficial part of the shellfish environment. So the purchase program going forwards, we're reducing the number of sites we work with. So 25 sites for the first phase of SOAR, we're reducing that down to 13. Jory highlighted a couple of sites that were less effective than others. They have obviously gone, and we're focusing in on those that were responding well to the treatment. But we're looking at working on 13 sites, another 30 acres of restoration, 2.5 million oysters going out. This is a map of those sites on the scale of the US. The individual sites are relatively small, but hopefully you can see the pink dots there. We've added California. We'll be working in Tamales Bay, north of San Francisco, continuing work in Puget Sound, and a similar suite of states from New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, and Maryland. And even in the first few months of this program, it looks like we're going to be able to add Maine to those states as well and actually establish new restoration sites in Maine. The monitoring that we hope to do through this next phase of SOAR is again looking at survival, growth and recruitment. They're the basic ecological measures that we need to keep track of. But as Jory described, the use of these large breeding adults in restoration is relatively new, and we're designing some work specifically to look at that return on investment that she alluded to. So what is the cost of an adult breeding oyster when you start with spat on shell as opposed to already grown singles? We are also measuring some of the ecosystem services. So there'll be denitrification measures done in the northeast, and we'll be using New Hampshire to look at fish production north of Cape Cod, which is a gap in our understanding. So really looking at developing the track record of this approach and the capacity to use the aquaculture industry for conservation. I mentioned securing long-term funding. And there is a very deliberate exit strategy for this program. It was over 10 years ago now. Actually, I was involved in starting a program with the Department of Agriculture's Natural Resource Conservation Service in Rhode Island. The NRCS program works with primary producers and develops ways of using those primary producers for conservation outcomes. Now, Department of Agriculture is far more used to working in the Midwest and working with terrestrial farmers than they are with the aquaculture industry, but they understand quite clearly that the shellfish growers are part of their primary producer client base, and they are also very appreciative of the need for additional marine habitats, these structured habitats that we're so short of. So what we want to do is help the Department of Agriculture, specifically the NRCS component of the Department of Agriculture, to include oyster reef restoration as part of their sponsored activities for their primary producers. It's something that many of the NRCS programs that we've spoken to are very interested in. They understand it, they just don't have the capacity. And they're also not geared up to generate the permits and do the stakeholder engagement work that's so important up front, and probably aren't the best group to be doing the monitoring and handling the data to develop adaptive management suggestions as the program moves forward. So there's definitely a place there for conservation organisations to work alongside NRCS but that is where we see this project as moving into the future. We will be continuing the innovation awards and looking for the ingenuity that comes out of the industry and developing projects that they see as being beneficial for both the industry and conservation. And as part of that, we'll be focusing really on creating some opportunities for underserved communities, looking at the diversity and equity component in the industry, and separating some of those funds specifically to develop the DEIJ component within the aquaculture industry. So that's where we hope to take the program. And with that, I will open it up for questions, I guess. Steve, over to you.
Yeah, that's great. Jory, Boze, thanks so much for the outline and sort of where we've been and where we're hoping to go. I might take a moment just to echo the partnerships Boze was mentioning. This was really a joint effort, particularly with the Pew Charitable Trusts and TNC really collaboratively working to stand up this program. And I think it is worth mentioning, at least for the work here in Massachusetts, Boze referencing the regulators, the Division of Marine Fisheries here in Massachusetts as a management and regulating agency was really helpful in the implementation of this program here in Massachusetts. And so I think it's hard to overstate the level of involvement and their enthusiastic support, which has been really great. So we've got a few questions here. Let's see. There are a couple of questions. It might be helpful, and Boze, I think you might be best suited for this. It might be helpful for the audience to hear like the 101 on oyster biology. There's a question about, how long does it take for an oyster to go from juvenile to adulthood? We talked about spat on shell as, one mechanism, larger adult single oysters that may have been really designed to go to the market. It might be helpful to give a quick primer on the biology here so that we're all on the same page.
Fantastic. Yeah, happy to do that. I love describing the sex lives of mollusks because they are wild. So a lot of mollusks, and certainly oysters amongst them, change sex as they grow. And oysters tend to be, it's described as being a protandrous hermaphrodite, one of those descriptions that only scientists could come up with. They tend to mature as males when they're smaller and younger, and as they grow, the percentage that convert to being females and are therefore producing eggs, which is the important metric, increases. So exactly where that 50-50 ratio is, the size at which you reach that 50-50 ratio varies by site. But that tends to be more like 3 years than earlier. So oysters are quite often capable of reproducing towards the end of their first season. They grow pretty fast, but the egg production is tiny. It's really inconsequential. They will start reproducing in a substantive way in their second and third years, but they're really not turning into females, if you like. They're not becoming female and producing eggs, which converts into larvae in the system until they're beyond 3 years. So that tends to be about the size of about the age of a legal-sized oyster. So that is part of the calculation. One of the things to keep in mind as we're trying to figure out where that return on investment is. How many you're losing as males. We tend to assume there are enough males in the system. It's the females that are the reproductive output, the reproductive biomass that we're interested in to develop the recruitment. And it's all about, creating a situation where there are more oysters settling on a reef than there are oysters dying. So you've actually got a reef that's growing over time.
Yeah, then there's I think we can make this a related question about sort of current populations of oysters compared to historical populations, you know, at different scales in history, 50, 100, 200 years ago. Boze, you'll have the best chance at responding.
Yeah,
Maybe
this is interesting, and it's sorry.
Just maybe I'll try to narrow it in that the global review of this information is one bit of information. Might you be able to downscale it to sort of our backyard here in the Northeast?
Sure. So, and it really is consistent around the globe. And it's not just the Western world. Working in Hong Kong and China makes it blindingly obvious the trajectory is the same in the East as well. You know, oysters have been fished for thousands of years. The Romans were actually importing oysters from England to Rome. They thought the English oysters were better than the local ones. So it's been going on for a very long time. The damage didn't really start until steam engines went into dredge boats. That happened in the mid-1800s. By about 1860, there was internal power in dredge boats, and you can imagine that really opens up the distance a boat can go, the amount of different weather conditions that a boat can dredge in, and the number of dredges that a boat can tow. You know, from one when the wind was good close to shore to towing 6 dredges pretty much anywhere and nearly any time, any weather conditions. So from the mid-1800s to about the turn of the last century, 1900, there was a mining out of the oyster stocks. And it's worth mentioning that once the oysters had gone, what was left was a big reef structure, which was actually pretty valuable as a source of lime for the lime kilns to burn. So the dredge boats, once they'd taken the oysters, went back out and cleaned up the reef, sold it to the lime kilns, and removed everything. What remained was sediment, sand, or mud. And that is exactly the same trajectory that's happened in the Northeast here. People have probably heard that, you know, Boston Harbor, New York Harbor, a lot of the areas close to shore in the Northeast contained massive oyster reef, the kind of reef that would break the surface at low tide and was a navigation hazard to the early sailing ships. They have all gone. We are well over 85% in the Northeast. We're closer to 99% of that habitat has gone. And in terms of, you know, why bother putting it back, really, in terms of ecological function, the oysters take over the reef building function from the coral reefs. Corals, you know, occur in the tropics. At low latitudes, as you move towards New England into the higher latitudes, the shellfish should take over that reef forming function and create reefs that are ecologically equivalent to coral reefs. But that's what's been dredged out.
Yeah, thanks for that. There's a couple of great questions in here. There's a question about sewage treatment, and particularly this is in the context of in Massachusetts or Cape Cod. Towns are talking about oysters in the same breath as sewage treatment. How do these two things work together to clean up estuaries? This is a really fascinating and interesting question that is incredibly related. It's very complicated, and I'll put in a plug because in several weeks we have another webinar where we're going to be diving deep on nutrient management in Massachusetts and beyond. I will start to just say that it's, you know, we think of oyster restoration and leveraging the aquaculture industry as tools to help improve the ecological condition in our estuaries. Certainly not going to be the only tool. I think also in the context of trying to restore the habitat that is largely gone, as Boze just outlined. Really critical to take stock of where we are and the tools that are available to us to improve the conditions of our estuaries, where we think oyster restoration and the aquaculture industry can play a meaningful role in the management of nutrients, and why sewage treatment is even in a breath in the same sentence is that in our area, the largest driver of nutrient pollution in our estuaries comes from how our wastewater is managed. So, Boze, I'm sure you're chomping at the bit to respond because you spend a lot of your days in this topic area. Maybe you can keep it brief for us.
I'll try, Steve. Yes, this could get detailed. But I think it's important to say up front that from my perspective, nutrient pollution in our nearshore areas is actually a bigger threat than climate change. It is enormous. I mean, these are the most productive areas of the entire ocean, and we are killing them off. The dead zones are increasing annually around the world. And it's, you know, the Northeast is certainly no exception. And to be killing off the most productive areas of the ocean is, you know, it's criminal. It has flow-on effects for fisheries, for recreation, for all manner of activities. And I would caution against using oysters, excuse me, oysters and sewage treatment in the same sentence. They are both involved in that nutrient management. So, you know, the nutrients contained in wastewater is an enormous input and really has to be dealt with through wastewater treatment. But there are lots of sources of nutrients contributing to that nutrient pollution and the anoxic conditions in summer and fish kills that follow that can't be treated at source. So we've got things like groundwater runoff, Cape Cod, sandy soils, and a lot of septic treatments. All of the nutrient that goes into those septics comes out again. It's just dissolved in water and will move slowly through the water table until it gets to the bays and estuaries. And there's probably another 40 years worth of nutrients that will make it into our bays and estuaries from that groundwater source, even if we stopped all nutrient going in from point sources today. So as we think about nutrient management, we need to include any mechanisms we have for taking the nutrient out of the marine system once it's got in. And that's where oysters come in. They are the most effective mechanism we have for removing nutrients from seawater once those nutrients have made it in. We need to do all we can to stop nutrients from getting to that point. But I mean, even atmospheric deposition from burning fossil fuels is significant, and you can't stop that. So we need a mechanism for dealing with that nutrient once it's in the water, and oysters are the champions at that.
Jory, this is a question for you related to sort of looking at an analysis that might help guide us in the future related to what you are presenting around the spat on shell and those juvenile oysters on one end versus the larger oysters, and sort of considering what you found in your analysis. Do you have any commentary about sort of like which might be better? You know, this, you can think of this from like a return on investment perspective, and maybe that's in an ecological sense, in a financial sense, in thinking about implementation of these projects.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that it's like one is necessarily better than the other. I think it's all site dependent and like where a project is happening. There are plenty of sites, especially, you know, in the South, like in the Virginia area, who have no problems with recruitment. Like they have crazy amounts of spat that settle. And so doing something like putting out adult oysters and spending more money to get those adult oysters to jumpstart recruitment in those areas might not be helpful, because they don't necessarily have a recruitment limited ecosystem. So putting out spout on shell in those kinds of areas might be good enough to increase the populations of oysters in those areas. However, in other recruitment limited sites, which is what the SOAR program was initially focused on, using the adult method to put out adult oysters, excuse me, might be a good thing to do in conjunction with putting out spout on shell, just so that you can still get a self-sustaining reef within a reasonable timeline, and still also have like a large biomass of oysters within a relatively quick time scale. I mean, quick meaning like a couple of years instead of like 10 years.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. Another follow-up, and curious to know if there were any surprising results as you were analyzing this information. And you could think, I know that you were compiling data across a wide geography and data that had been collected by, disparate groups and was in sort of in different formats. In your analysis, were you surprised? What were, and the follow-up to this question is like, did they spur on any future questions that you think need answering?
I think myself included and other people working on the SOAR program were surprised with some of the anecdotal data that we received on juvenile settlement and recruitment. Especially, I showed you some data from the New Hampshire site. We heard some anecdotal evidence to show that like they've never seen recruitment in this area for like this and in such a long time. And so that was really surprising, especially since it was, only after one deployment of SOAR oysters, of putting out adult oysters. So that was really surprising and encouraging. As far as going forward, I think, because this method is so focused on jumpstarting the breeding biomass of the oyster reef, really getting at, is that because of putting out adult oysters, or is that an anomaly? That would be the main question in my mind going forward.
Great, thanks very much. I'm going to try to combine a couple of questions here, which in some ways pulls on the thread of nutrient mitigation as well as harvest management. So there's a question about, like, what happens when you leave the oysters in place as opposed to harvesting them? Like, whose oysters are they in some respect? Also, let me find it here. There's a question about the intention to have one of these restoration and habitat constructed areas as a sort of no-take zone, a no-harvest zone, as opposed to allowing some amount of harvest. So I might make a comment and then look to Boze for some follow-up. It's important to note that when we have been involved in projects in Massachusetts, that we have done so with and in collaboration with the municipality that we're working in. In Massachusetts, that's just a fact of life in how natural resources are managed, including in our coastal areas. The town has significant control and ultimate authority, along with the State Fisheries Agency and the Division of Marine Fisheries. So the ongoing management of a project site that we've worked on really falls to this co-management scheme between the town and the state. And so we have looked for places that we're confident that the management of these project areas are meant to do what they are meant to do, and these are ecological restoration projects. So It's also important to note that here in Massachusetts, there is a longstanding history and culture around shellfish harvest, like there has been in many other places. And so we basically, look for places where we think a project will be successful from an ecological perspective, but we also need to take into account, what the community is interested in seeing. So Boze, on the nutrient management side, perhaps even faster than the last response, you could give a primer on denitrification, not only perhaps from an aquaculture setting, from a reef setting. Maybe that can tie in the resiliency fund program. That might bring us right to the end of our time.
I'll try and be quick. So I've mentioned that oysters are the champions at removing nutrient once it gets into the marine space. There are two mechanisms for doing that. If you're thinking of an aquaculture area, as oysters grow, they are taking phytoplankton out of the water by their filtration feeding. They're eating the nutrient that's contained in those phytoplankton cells is what they use to grow. And that nitrogen essentially is the element that we're talking about. Is incorporated both shell and soft tissue and harvested when the oyster comes out. That's one mechanism. It's significant because there are a lot of oysters being grown, but it's actually smaller, particularly per unit area, than denitrification. And denitrification is a process that's done by bacteria. The oysters are just driving it. And for this, you need to think about the filtration of oysters. They take pretty much all of the particles out of the water. They eat only the ones they want. The rest are attached to a mucus thread and they spit them out. They're heavy and they sink. So nearly all of the particulate in the water gets deposited into the reef. It does two things. One, it makes the water much clearer and gets seagrass going and helps with photosynthesis on the bottom, which produces oxygen and combats that low oxygen fish kill scenario. But all of that particulate coming out of the water is actually does two things actually. It feeds all the invertebrates, all the little amphipods and polychaete worms and all of the stuff that is fish food and produces millions of baby fish or feeds millions of baby fish explode. You get a huge biomass of essentially what is fish food, but it is also feeding that bacterial community, which uses the organically available nitrogen compounds, the ammonia, nitrate, nitrites, and they use them the same way that we use glucose to produce energy. The byproduct is nitrogen gas. 78% of what we're breathing now, it's inert and it's out of the system. And that's the biggest impact on removing nitrogen pollution from the ocean, is that denitrification. And it does go into your comment about harvest, because when you're talking about those kind of functions of a reef, it's actually the reef that's important. It's the habitat. It's that reef that's producing the fish food that supports, thousands of baby fish and actually increases the fish production to our fisheries. It's that reef that is the habitat that drives the bacterial community, which is taking the nutrient pollution out of the water. And the oysters are important because they're the mechanism that keeps it going. But to think about who owns those oysters is to really discredit the value that you get from the finfish produced, from the nutrients that are taken out, from the shoreline protection that you get. And there is value in that reef itself. And I tend to look at this as, and one of the values is actually providing the larvae, the oyster larvae, that can then repopulate other areas. So looking after that reef is pretty important. And it's certainly an obligation from a conservation organisation, because we are spending somebody's money to put that reef there in the first place. And it's not a put and take fishery. So the way I see it is that for reef restoration, we are focusing on the functions of the reef. And for the shellfish harvest, there are other mechanisms for doing that. One of them is making sure that you've got enough oyster reef in the system to be providing the larvae to fuel recreational fisheries.
Thanks for that, Boze. We're gonna wrap up. I'll take the final word just to say that I think we've been really fortunate to be able to participate with this SOAR program. It's been great to be able to provide an update. You know, we're really looking at this as an opportunity to work with and leverage the aquaculture industry. We need their businesses to survive and do the good work that they're doing by, you know, growing food, the economic impact, the jobs, but then the ecosystem services, the things that we're looking for in our habitat restoration mindset, they're providing. They're a great partner, and to be able to lean into that industry to support habitat restoration has been really rewarding for me personally and for the organization. It's been excellent. So I'm going to close this out here and say thank you for joining us, and thank you to everyone who tuned in and for your support of the Nature Conservancy. Your support is what makes this and all of the work that we do possible. So we'll be sending everyone a follow-up email over the coming days with a link to a recording of the webinar. And if you're enjoying this webinar series, please be sure to share them with your friends and colleagues. You can follow us on social media at conserve_MA on Facebook and Instagram, and keep up with our work and get updates on upcoming virtual opportunities to connect with us. As always, you can register for future webinars at nature.org/MA webinars. And the next webinar, which is on June 8th, we'll look at the deployment of offshore wind and how we can generate renewable energy and maximize the environmental benefits of this booming industry. So join us for that one. A final thank you to Boze Hancock. It's been a pleasure having you to get your expertise here. Jory, for your short stint with us, an impactful one, wrangling all of the information from the SOAR program. It's been great working with you. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.